So much to unpack with this story. We wanted to reach Sinan Ciddi with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, joining us tonight from Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us on the program tonight. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
So what does the tightness of this result and how combative both sides are being? We just heard from Trent there, a reporter on the ground. What does that all tell you about how fraught this outcome is going to be?
I think it says a lot. There's been a lot of hype and excitement, and justifiably so, around the defeat of Tayyip Erdogan in the last couple of months here, and as well as Turkey, simply because given the state of the economic relations that the country is in, with high inflation and consumer prices, as well as a depreciated currency, there was an expectation that Mr. Erdogan would be defeated handsomely in the first round, and that doesn't appear to have happened. Now, as your correspondent stated, it could still happen, but the chances are slim. But it does suggest that Mr. Erdogan may have overperformed, and the opposition alliance's candidate, Mr. Kilicdaroglu, does appear to have underperformed, especially given expectations. And right now, what we're seeing is basically that it could go to a second round.
And as I was saying earlier, Erdogan was just out there talking to the crowd of supporters, and he was saying that he's far out in front in the results. And he also said that anybody telling people otherwise is trying to fool them. And then meantime, during that same speech, he also said that if there were to be a runoff, he would respect that. What do you think of that comment?
I think it also shows a lot. His famous balcony speech, which he basically gives after every successive electoral victory he's had, is basically to rally the crowd and thank them for their services as well as their support. It very much smelled of that. And I, at one point, I actually thought he declared victory. But what it ended up being was a non-victory victory speech, basically going right up to the line, saying that they were ahead in the polls, that it was within their power to essentially grasp victory. But if it goes to a second round, that would be fine by them. In contrast, the opposition alliance, Mr. Kilicdaroglu, came on stage, and instead of being in front of a sort of jubilant and big crowd outside addressing his supporters, it was in this sort of closed sort of auditorium with a bunch of journalists, I think, just weakly clapping at the fact that he said they will defend the vote and they will fight till the end, and even if it is a second round. So right now, I think the outcome is on a knife's edge, but Erdogan does seem very bullish, and Mr. Kilicdaroglu and the opposition seem a little bit stupefied, and they have been off the air and not really speaking to their supporters, especially Mr. Kilicdaroglu, until recently.
Okay, that is interesting. Now, the other thing that's so fascinating about all of this is Erdogan has had such a firm grip, an increasingly firm grip, really, for 20 years on Turkey. Yet right now, despite what we're seeing and how tight this is, a runoff could happen. The country could potentially be on the verge of a major change there if he were to lose. What's your sense as to why, especially going into tonight, this race was so tight to begin with?
You see, that's a really good question. And I think sort of pollsters, electoral specialists, as well as political scientists will have time to figure this out going forward. It was very surprising that if you look at the vote coming out of the earthquake-stricken zones, Mr. Erdogan seems to have still held his base vote there, despite losing its level of support by a few percentage points. But he's still rock solid, even though initially following the earthquakes in February, we thought he would take essentially a heavy beating there. By vote numbers, but it doesn't seem to have happened. The only explanation I have as to now is if you look at voters basically sort of thinking, well, who should I vote for president, Mr. Erdogan or Mr. Kilicdaroglu, right? They're making a calculation in their head in terms of, well, who's likely to give me a better sort of economic future, be it retirement salaries, minimum wage, or actual sort of spoils that he's distributed amongst voters. And it looks like, rather than quality of democracy preferences, voters are essentially prioritizing Mr. Erdogan, as far as, 1 out of 2 voters, in going with the devil that they know. That should be tempered by essentially saying that, though, it looks like an even split between the two candidates. And the only reason why one hasn't come out and the other is because there is a third-party candidate in there who seems to have polled just above 5%. Thereby denying a victory to one of the candidates outright.
So that's the situation there in Turkey for folks on the ground. But as I sit here in Canada, you're there in Washington, D.C. I'm curious about the international community as well, because Turkey certainly plays such an outsized role and is so critical in so many diplomatic situations. So what do you think the main differences would be in terms of how Erdogan would interact with the international community going forward compared to that main challenger?
Gosh, yeah. I mean, if Mr. Erdogan wins again, I mean, he's certainly indicated that he's interested in resetting ties with his Western partners and allies, specifically in the United States. He's offered some sort of tidbits in the last few weeks in terms of, positive moves and outreach towards the United States, although that still remains to be seen if he intends to follow through with that. If Mr. Kilicdaroglu wins, I think the opposition has said unequivocally that they would reinstate their sort of close relationship with the West, especially NATO, the European Union, and really resituate Turkey back into its sort of traditional Western anchor. There are still some question marks as to whether they would fully back international sanctions against Russia. But I think the international community would be much happier if Mr. Kilicdaroglu assumed the presidency, simply because, he is widely expected to pursue closer relations with Turkey's traditional Western partners and allies.
Sinan, such an important conversation for the world to be watching closely. Thank you so much for joining us to unpack all of it.
Thank you.
Sinan Ciddi is in Washington, D.C. He's a senior non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies.